The forgotten bride at Willow Creek Station found the one man who wouldn't lie to her. The train left her behind like she was only another piece of baggage. By the time the last black smoke faded into the Wyoming sky, Grace Miller still stood on the wooden platform of Willow Creek Station with one hand on her brown traveling trunk and the other wrapped around a small white envelope that had been folded and unfolded too many times. Dust clung to the hem of her blue dress. Her bonnet ribbon had come loose in the wind. A long day of travel had taken the shine from her face, but not the worry from her eyes. She had been promised a welcome. Not a grand one. Grace had never needed grand things. She had been promised a man standing near the ticket office, wearing a dark coat and carrying a yellow rose so she would know him. She had been promised a wagon ride to a ranch called Silver Lantern. She had been promised supper, a warm room, and a new life as Mrs. Thomas Redding before the month was out. But there was no yellow rose. There was no dark coat. There was no Thomas Redding. Only a sleepy station master locking his window, two boys chasing each other past the water barrel, and a few townsfolk who glanced at her just long enough to understand she was waiting for someone who had not come. Grace tried to stand straighter. She had come from St. Louis with good gloves, a careful heart, and her mother's pearl hair comb wrapped in a handkerchief at the bottom of her bag. She had crossed miles of flat land and hard country because Thomas Redding's letters had sounded honest. He had written of loneliness, of wanting a wife who could read ledgers and help him build a home. He had written that the West was not easy, but it gave a person room to breathe. Grace had believed that most of all. Room to breathe. Back in St. Louis, she had been the quiet daughter in the back room of her uncle's mercantile, the woman who kept accounts, mended cuffs, served guests, and smiled when everyone else decided her future for her. Thomas's letters had felt like a door opening where there had only been a wall. Now the door had led to an empty platform. She looked down at the envelope in her hand. The last letter had arrived 3 weeks earlier. Come on the Friday train. I will be waiting before sunset. Do not fear the distance, Grace. By the time you see Willow Creek, you will already be home. The words blurred, though she refused to let tears fall. A horse shifted near the hitching rail. Somewhere beyond the station, a saloon piano started up with a tired little tune. The town smelled of dust, horses, lamp oil, and wood smoke. It was not cruel. That almost made it worse. Life went on around her as if her heart had not just fallen through the boards beneath her boots. The station master, a thin man with gray whiskers, came out carrying a ring of keys. "Miss," he said gently, "you waiting on someone?" Grace folded the letter once more. "Yes," she said. He looked toward the road, then toward the darkening sky. His face changed just enough for her to notice. "Maybe he got held up," he said. "Maybe. You got a place in town." She swallowed. "I was meant to." The station master nodded the way people nod when they have guessed too much and do not know how to say it kindly. "There's a boarding house 2 streets over. Mrs. Bell keeps clean rooms." Grace reached for her purse before she remembered how little was left inside. Train fare had taken most of it. Her new life was supposed to begin before money became a worry. "I'll manage," she said. The station master hesitated, but a woman called for him from inside the office, and he went back in with one last troubled glance. Grace stood alone again. She could hear the town beginning its evening, doors closing, men laughing, wheels creaking in the road, a dog barking at nothing. The western sky glowed red behind the hills, and that red light made everything look warmer than it felt. She tried to lift her trunk. It barely moved. That was when a man stepped out of the shadow beside the freight shed. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, with a dark hat pulled low and a weathered coat that had seen more winters than comfort. He had a coil of rope over one arm and a sack of feed over the other shoulder. His face was not handsome in the polished way Thomas had described himself. This man's face was plain, sun-browned, and serious, marked by work and silence. He looked at the trunk, then at Grace, then at the empty road. "Ma'am," he said, taking off his hat, "that trunk looks like it has more stubbornness than sense." Grace stared at him. She should have been afraid. A woman alone in a strange town ought to be careful. Her mother had told her so at least 12 times before she boarded the train, but there was nothing sharp in the man's eyes, no grin, no bold look, only concern held back by manners. "It has more of my life in it than I expected," she said. Something in his face softened. "You waiting on Redding?" The name struck her harder than she wanted it to. "You know him?" "I know his name," the man said. "That is not the same thing." Grace's fingers tightened around the envelope. "He was to meet me." The man looked toward the road again. His jaw moved once, like he had bitten down on words he did not think a stranger should hear. "My name is Caleb Hart," he said. "I run a place north of town, the Ash Hollow Ranch." "I am Grace Miller." He nodded. The wind lifted a strand of hair loose from beneath her bonnet and pushed it across her cheek. She did not fix it. She was too tired to care. Caleb looked at the station door, then at the road, then back at her. "Miss Miller, I can carry that trunk to Mrs. Bell's boarding house. After that, I can ask a few questions, quietly." "You don't owe me that." "No," he said, "I don't." He did not add anything else. That made the offer feel heavier, not lighter. Grace looked at him for a long moment. She had trusted a man through paper and ink, and it had brought her to this platform with night coming on. Now another man stood before her with dust on his boots and no promise in his mouth. That was what made her answer. "All right," she said. Caleb picked up the trunk as if it were troublesome but not impossible. Grace took her smaller bag and followed him down the station steps. They had gone only a few yards when a rider came fast around the corner by the livery. He pulled up hard, making his horse toss its head. The rider leaned down to Caleb and spoke in a low voice. Grace heard only 4 words. "Redding left yesterday morning." Caleb turned still as fence wire in winter. Grace stopped walking. The envelope slipped from her hand and landed face down in the dust. Grace did not move at first. The dust held the envelope like a hand had laid it there on purpose. Caleb looked from the rider to Grace, then down at the letter near her boot. For a moment, the whole street seemed to hold its breath. Even the horse under the rider stopped shifting. "What do you mean he left?" Caleb asked. The rider, a narrow-faced young man with pale hair and nervous eyes, glanced at Grace and seemed to wish he had waited until she was gone. "I only heard it from Mr. Wilkes at the livery," he said. "Redding paid for a fresh team yesterday near sunup, said he had business east of here. Took the north road first, then cut toward Denver." Grace bent slowly and picked up the envelope. Her fingers left a clean mark in the dust. "Was he alone?" she asked. The rider swallowed. "Yes, ma'am, least that's what I heard." "Did he leave a message?" "No, ma'am." The words were small, but they landed hard. Caleb's face tightened. "Go on home, Ben." The rider tipped his hat awkwardly and rode away without another word. Grace stood with the envelope in both hands. The last red light of the day burned along the edge of the rooftops. She could feel people watching from porches and doorways, not openly, just enough to make the air feel full of eyes. Caleb said nothing. That silence saved her from breaking. Had he offered pity, she might have cried. Had he cursed Thomas Redding, she might have defended the man out of old habit. Had he told her it would be all right, she might have hated him for making a promise no one could prove. Instead, he simply shifted the trunk higher in his arms and said, "Mrs. Bell's place is this way." Grace nodded and walked beside him. Willow Creek was smaller than she had imagined from Thomas's letters. He had written of a lively town with good people, a proper church, a fine hotel, and streets that would remind her there was civilization even at the edge of wild country. But what she saw were uneven boardwalks, a blacksmith shop with a crooked sign, a dry goods store with a cracked front window, and a church steeple that leaned a little against the sky. It was not ugly, it was just real. Thomas had made it sound polished. Caleb did not try to fill the walk with talk. Grace was grateful for that, though the silence had a sharpness of its own. Each step carried her farther from the train station and closer to the truth. Thomas Redding had known she was coming. He had received her letter. He had named the day. He had named the train. Then he had left. Mrs. Bell's boarding house sat behind a low fence with 2 lanterns burning in the windows. It had lace curtains, a porch swept clean, and a wooden bell by the door that gave the place its name. Caleb set the trunk down and knocked. A round woman with silver hair opened almost at once. Her gaze went first to Caleb, then to Grace, then to the trunk. She understood more quickly than Grace wanted her to. "Come in, child," Mrs. Bell said. Grace stepped into a narrow hall that smelled of bread, starch, and lavender. The warmth nearly undid her. Her knees trembled, and she put one hand against the wall to steady herself. Mrs. Bell saw it but did not fuss. She turned to Caleb. "Parlor," she said. He carried the trunk in and set it by the sofa. Grace stood near the doorway, unsure whether she was a guest, a burden, or a story the town would be telling before breakfast. "I can pay for one night," Grace said. Mrs. Bell looked at her gloves, her traveling dress, her tired face. "One night can be settled in the morning." "No," Grace said softly. "I'd rather settle what I can now." Pride was a thin blanket, but it was all she had left. Caleb reached into his coat. Grace turned toward him at once. "Please don't." His hand stopped. "I was only going to say I have business with Mrs. Bell," he said, though they both knew it was not true. Mrs. Bell folded her arms. "The room is $2 for the week." Grace opened her purse. There was less than that inside. A few coins, a folded ticket stub, a small key to the trunk. Her face grew hot. Caleb looked at the window, giving her the mercy of not watching her count. Grace closed the purse. "I have a pearl comb," she said. "It belonged to my mother. I can leave it with you until I find work." Mrs. Bell's expression changed. Not pity, something softer and older. "You'll do no such thing," she said. "You can help me with the breakfast dishes for now. We'll call that good until you know where you stand." Grace tried to answer, but her throat closed. Caleb picked up his hat from the side table. "I'll come by in the morning," he said, "if you still want questions asked." Grace looked at him. If he left town, there may be nothing to ask. "There is always something," Caleb said. "Why?" she whispered. He paused by the door. "Why what? Why help me?" Caleb's eyes moved to the trunk, then to the envelope still in her hand. "Because someone should have been standing at that station," he said, "and he was." Then he left. Mrs. Bell took Grace upstairs to a small back room beneath the slanted roof. There was a narrow bed, a washstand, a chair, and a window looking out over the alley toward the dark shape of the hills. It was not the room she had crossed the country for. There was no yellow rose on the table, no smiling fiancé in the doorway, no promise waiting under lamplight. But the sheets were clean. Mrs. Bell lit the lamp and placed it on the washstand. "You need anything, you knock," she said. Grace nodded. When she was alone, she untied her bonnet with shaking hands. She sat on the bed and stared at the letter. Then, for the first time since the train pulled away, she opened it again. The handwriting looked the same, steady, warm, certain. "By the time you see Willow Creek, you will already be home." Grace pressed the paper to her lap. A laugh came out of her, but it was small and broken. Not because it was funny, because the lie was so neat, so carefully folded, so easy to carry all that way. She stood and opened her trunk. Inside were the things she had chosen for a life that no longer existed. 2 dresses, a Bible, her mother's comb, a jar of face cream wrapped in cloth, account books, a white apron, a blue ribbon tied around every letter Thomas Redding had ever sent her. She lifted the bundle out and held it near the lamp. For a wild second, she wanted to burn it. Instead, she placed it in the drawer of the little washstand and shut it carefully. Grace Miller had been raised not to make decisions in the first storm of feeling. Her father had taught her that ledgers looked different in the morning. Her mother had taught her that pain could make a person foolish if they let it choose too soon. So she took off her gloves. She washed the dust from her face. She braided her hair with fingers that would not quite obey her. Then she knelt beside the bed, but no prayer came. Only one sentence turned over and over in her mind. "He knew I was coming." Outside, somewhere in the cold Wyoming night, a horse gave a low, restless sound. Downstairs, Mrs. Bell moved about the kitchen. Across town, men were likely already speaking Thomas Redding's name over cards and whiskey. And 12 miles north, Caleb Hart rode home under a sky full of hard stars, carrying a question he had not spoken aloud. Why would a man run the day before his bride arrived? Morning came gray and cold, with frost silvering the porch rail outside Mrs. Bell's boarding house. Grace woke before the bell rang for breakfast. For a moment she did not remember where she was. She reached toward the empty side of the narrow bed as if the shape of the room might explain itself. Then she saw the washstand, the low ceiling, the brown trunk by the wall, and memory came back in one hard piece. Willow Creek. Thomas gone. The letters in the drawer. She sat up slowly and pressed both feet to the floor. Her dress from the day before hung over the chair, tired and wrinkled from travel. She took out her plain gray dress from the trunk, brushed it as best she could, and pinned her hair without using the pearl comb. The comb stayed wrapped in its cloth under the Bible. Some things, she decided, should not be brought out on a morning like this. Downstairs, Mrs. Bell was already making biscuits. Grace stepped into the kitchen, and tied on the white apron she had packed for a ranch home that had never opened its door. "I said breakfast dishes," Mrs. Bell told her, turning from the stove. "Not the whole meal." "I'm awake," Grace said, "and my hands need something honest to do." Mrs. Bell looked at her for a second, then handed her a bowl of flour. "Then mix." By 7, the kitchen was warm with steam and bread. 2 traveling salesmen ate in the dining room, speaking low when they saw Grace enter with coffee. A widow named Mrs. Pike watched her with sharp little eyes, then softened when Grace refilled her cup without spilling. No one asked about Thomas Redding. That was worse somehow. Questions could be answered, silence had corners. After breakfast, Grace washed plates while Mrs. Bell dried. The older woman hummed a hymn beneath her breath, and the sound was steady enough that Grace found herself breathing easier. "You handled yourself well last night," Mrs. Bell said. Grace scrubbed a plate too hard. "I don't know that I handled anything." "You stood upright. Some days that is plenty." Grace looked down at the dishwater. "Do people know?" "People know a man left town and a woman came looking for him. What they do not know, they will try to decorate." Grace nodded. Mrs. Bell set a dry plate on the shelf. "Do not let a town's tongue decide who you are. Willow Creek talks when the wind changes direction." A knock sounded at the front door. Mrs. Bell wiped her hands. "That will be Mr. Hart." Grace's hand tightened around the wet cloth before she could stop it. Caleb stood in the parlor with his hat in his hands and the morning frost still on the shoulders of his coat. He looked as if he had slept little and ridden early. His boots were marked with fresh mud, and there was a thin line of dust on one cheek. "I asked at the livery," he said once Mrs. Bell left them alone. "Redding hired a team under his own name, paid cash, bought supplies for 4 days." Grace stood very still. "So he planned it." "Yes." The simple word hurt more than a long explanation. Caleb continued carefully. "He sold 2 horses the same morning, not good horses from what Wilkes said, but enough to raise money. He also closed his account at the bank." Grace looked toward the window. Across the street, a man swept the boardwalk in front of the dry goods store. Life had such cruel manners. It kept moving while a person stood still. "He did not leave suddenly," she said. "No. He left because he knew I was coming." Caleb did not answer at once. "I cannot prove that yet." "But you believe it." His silence was answer enough. Grace turned away from the window. Her face was pale, but her voice did not shake. "Then I need work." Caleb blinked once, as if he had expected tears, anger, anything but that. "Work." "I cannot pay Mrs. Bell in sorrow. I will not go back to St. Louis on shame and borrowed money. I can keep ledgers, write letters, manage accounts, so, if needed, cook well enough when I know the stove, and I can learn the rest." A faint look crossed Caleb's face, not amusement, respect. "Ash Hollow's books are a mess," he said. "How much of a mess?" "The kind a man keeps in a flour sack when he loses the ledger." Grace stared at him. "You keep your accounts in a flour sack." I did not say I was proud of it. For the first time since the station, something almost like a smile touched her mouth. It disappeared quickly, but Caleb had seen it, and the sight of it seemed to ease a little of the worry in his shoulders. I can pay wages, he said. Not fine wages. There's a small room off the kitchen if Mrs. Bell thinks it proper, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Lottie Finch, comes 3 days a week. She is 62, sharp as a sewing needle, and would sooner strike me with a broom than permit foolish talk. Grace studied him. You are offering me a position. I am. Because you need help with accounts. Yes. And because I need a place to stand. Caleb looked down at his hat. That too. Grace appreciated that he did not pretend otherwise. The town will say things, she said. The town has already begun. I will not be taken in as charity. It is not charity if you save me from losing money. I do not know I am losing. Mrs. Bell returned with a tray of coffee, though Grace suspected she had been listening from the hall. Ash Hollow is respectable, Mrs. Bell said. Lottie Finch will keep it that way. Mr. Hart is stubborn but not wicked. High praise, Caleb said. It is the only kind you've earned. Grace looked between them. Her pride wanted a cleaner path. Her fear wanted a train east. But somewhere beneath both was a small, steady voice that sounded like survival. I'll look at the accounts first, she said, before I agree. Caleb's mouth twitched. That may cause you to refuse. Then you should have kept better accounts. This time, Mrs. Bell laughed outright. Later that afternoon, Grace walked to the post office with Caleb beside her. She had written one letter to her mother, careful and incomplete. She said Willow Creek was smaller than expected. She said the weather was colder. She said plans had changed, but she was safe for the present. She did not write that her promised fiancé had run. Not yet. A mother's heart should not be struck from 800 miles away without a gentler warning. The postmistress, Miss Ada Whitcomb, took the letter and looked at Grace over her spectacles. You're Miss Miller? Yes. Ada stamped the envelope. I remember Redding receiving letters from St. Louis. Grace felt Caleb grow still beside her. How many? Grace asked. Ada glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice. Enough that I thought he was either courting seriously or lying seriously. The room seemed to narrow. Caleb stepped closer to the counter. Miss Whitcomb. Ada held up one thin hand. I do not read mail, Mr. Hart, but I do notice names. And I notice when a man receives letters tied to one city, then sends letters to another under a different return. Grace's pulse thudded in her ears. Another city, she asked. Ada looked at her with pity she tried to hide. Cheyenne, she said, before yours, maybe 6 months ago. Grace's hand went to the edge of the counter. Caleb reached out, not touching her, but near enough that she knew his hand was there. If this moment touched your heart, stay with the story, because Grace has only found the first loose thread, and the truth behind Thomas Redding has not yet shown its whole face. Grace drew one slow breath. What name? She asked. Ada's eyes moved to the window, where the cold light made every dust speck visible. I cannot be sure of the woman, she said, but I remember the return name he used. Caleb's voice was low. What was it? Ada looked back at them. Thomas Vale. The name Thomas Vale sat in the little post office like a snake under a flour sack. Grace did not speak at first. She kept one hand on the counter and the other pressed against the envelope she had just mailed to her mother. For a strange moment, she wished she could pull it back. She wished she had written the whole truth. She wished she had written nothing at all. Caleb's face had gone hard, but his voice stayed calm. Are you certain? He asked. Ada Whitcomb gave him a look sharp enough to cut twine. I have sorted mail in this town for 21 years, Mr. Hart. I may forget where I set my teacup, but I do not forget a man changing his name. Grace turned toward her. Did he use both names here? Not openly, Ada said. The letters from Cheyenne came addressed to Thomas Vale, care of Willow Creek Post Office. He collected them himself. Later, letters came from St. Louis addressed to Thomas Redding. Same man, same hand when he signed for them. Grace felt heat climb into her cheeks. Not shame this time, anger. Thomas had not merely failed her. He had built a road of lies and asked her to walk it in her best dress. Do you remember the Cheyenne woman's name? Grace asked. Ada looked troubled. The writing was poor on one envelope. I remember the first name may have been Clara or Cora. I cannot swear to it. Caleb glanced at Grace. That is enough to begin. To begin what? Grace asked. To find out whether Redding has done this before. Grace drew back a little. Mr. Hart, I came here to marry him, not chase him. I know. I do not want my whole life to become a hunt for a man who did not even have the courage to face me. Caleb accepted the words without defense. Then we do not hunt him for your sake alone. We learn enough so he cannot do this to another woman without someone knowing what he is. Ada nodded slowly. That is the right road. Grace lowered her eyes. She thought of another woman in Cheyenne, waiting by a window, reading letters that might have sounded tender and true. A woman who had perhaps been spared the train ride west, or perhaps not. The thought made Grace's stomach tighten. What if she came too? She whispered. No one answered. By noon, Caleb had brought the flour sack. He set it on Mrs. Bell's parlor table with the care of a man laying down a wounded bird. Grace stared at it, then at him. These are your accounts. Most of them. Most. There may be a cigar box in the barn. Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. Mrs. Bell, sitting near the window with her mending, made a dry sound. I hope you own more cattle than sense, Mr. Hart. I do, Caleb said, by a fair number. Grace untied the sack and tipped the contents onto the table. Papers slid out in a loose, dusty heap. Receipts, notes, torn billheads, feed orders, lists of cattle sold, 3 bank slips, and 1 folded paper that appeared to contain nothing but a drawing of a horse standing beside a fence. Grace lifted it between 2 fingers. Caleb looked embarrassed. That was from my hired boy's nephew. Is the horse part of the account? No. Then we shall remove him from the account. Yes, ma'am. She arranged the papers in piles. Income, expenses, debts, unknown, very unknown. Caleb stood by the mantel as if afraid to sit. His hat turned slowly in his hands, brim passing through his fingers again and again. Grace noticed the habit. It was the first nervous thing she had seen in him. You may sit down, she said. I might be in the way. You are already in the way standing there. Mrs. Bell smiled into her mending. Caleb sat. For 2 hours, Grace worked with quiet focus. The pain from the station did not vanish, but numbers gave it walls. A figure either matched or did not. A receipt belonged to a date or it did not. Lies could hide in letters, but accounts told their own truth if a person had patience enough to listen. Caleb watched her sort, mark, and question. He answered plainly when he knew. When he did not know, he said so. Grace found that oddly comforting. Thomas had always seemed to have an answer ready. Caleb's honesty was less smooth, but stronger under the hand. You paid twice for the same feed delivery, she said after a while. I did. Yes. Caleb leaned over the table. Are you sure? Grace looked up. He cleared his throat. That was a foolish question. It was. I apologize. She pointed with her pencil. You also sold 6 head in August but wrote payment for 5. His brow lowered. To Brant Cole. Yes. Caleb's jaw tightened. Brant Cole knew there were 6. Then Brant Cole owes you for 1. He will not enjoy hearing that. Few people enjoy paying what they owe. Caleb looked at her across the table, and something like quiet admiration passed over his face. What? She asked. You are not afraid of much when you have a pencil in your hand. Grace looked down at the pencil. I am afraid of plenty, she said. I just prefer not to be useless while afraid. The room went still. Caleb did not answer quickly. When he did, his voice was lower. That is a fine way to live. Grace kept her eyes on the figures, but her hand paused before writing the next number. By late afternoon, she had filled 6 pages in a clean ledger Mrs. Bell lent her from an old cabinet. The Ash Hollow Ranch was not ruined, but it was leaking money through carelessness, trust, and habit. Caleb had good land, healthy cattle, and poor records. That could be mended. Some things could be mended. Others, Grace was beginning to understand, had to be named before they could be left behind. When Caleb rose to go, She tied the finished papers with string and placed the rest back into the sack. "I will take the position," she said. He looked at her carefully. "You need not decide today." "I have decided. It is 12 miles out, quieter than town, harder in winter. I crossed half the country to marry a man who lied under 2 names. A quiet ranch does not frighten me." Caleb gave the smallest nod. "I will speak to Lottie Finch tonight," he said. "Mrs. Bell can ride out with you tomorrow and see the room herself if that eases things." "It does," Mrs. Bell said before Grace could answer. Caleb put on his hat. At the door he paused. "I am sorry," he said. Grace knew he did not only mean Thomas. He meant the platform, the letters, the name Thomas Vale, and the way one day had taken so much from her. She looked at him steadily. "I know." After he left, Grace carried the ledger upstairs and placed it on the washstand. Then she opened the drawer and looked at the blue-tied bundle of Thomas's letters. For the first time, they did not look like promises. They looked like evidence. She untied the ribbon with slow fingers and began reading them again, not as a hopeful woman, but as a careful one. Near the bottom of the 3rd letter, beside a line about the Silver Lantern Ranch, she found something she had never noticed before. Thomas had written that the cottonwoods stood west of the creek. But Caleb had said Silver Lantern had no creek. Grace sat back, the letter trembling in her hand. The ranch he had promised her might not even exist. Grace read the line 3 times. "The cottonwoods stand west of the creek, where the afternoon light falls soft." It was a pretty sentence. It had been pretty the first time she read it in St. Louis, sitting by the stove while rain tapped the back windows of her uncle's mercantile. She remembered smiling at it then. She remembered imagining a house near running water, trees moving in the wind, a man waiting on the porch with a steady hand and an honest future. Now the sentence looked different. It looked dressed up. She pulled another letter from the stack and searched it with fresh eyes. Thomas had mentioned Silver Lantern Ranch 7 times across his letters. He had described the front porch, the barn, the well, the creek, the cottonwoods, the east pasture, the view of distant hills. But he had never once mentioned a neighbor by name. Never once mentioned a church social, a town doctor, a blacksmith, a store owner, a real person with real dust on their boots. He had written a dream with no witnesses. Grace felt cold, though the little room was warm from the chimney pipe running through the wall. She stood and paced from the bed to the washstand, then back again. The floorboards gave small, tired creaks beneath her steps. A knock came at the door. "Miss Grace," Mrs. Bell called softly, "you still awake?" Grace opened the door with the letter in her hand. Mrs. Bell looked at her face, then at the paper. "Another bad thing." "I do not know yet." That is often how bad things introduce themselves. Grace almost smiled, but the feeling did not reach her mouth. "He wrote about a ranch called Silver Lantern," Grace said. "Caleb said there is no creek there. Do you know that place?" Mrs. Bell's mouth tightened. "There was a Silver Lantern Ranch once," she said. "Not here in Willow Creek, south of Laramie, I believe, burned years ago before I came west." Grace looked down at the letter. "Then he may have stolen the name. Men like Redding steal whatever has shine on it." The words were plain, but not cruel. Grace sat on the edge of the bed. Mrs. Bell entered and closed the door behind her. She lowered herself into the chair with the slow care of a woman whose knees had earned the right to complain. "You need sleep," she said. "I need sense." "Sleep helps with that." Grace handed her the letter. "Read this line." Mrs. Bell took the paper and read beneath the lamp. Her eyes moved carefully. When she finished, she placed the letter on her lap. "Sounds like a man writing for a woman's heart, not from his own land." Grace's throat tightened. "I thought I was careful." Being careful does not stop another person from being false. "I answered every letter with thought. I asked practical questions. I asked about winter feed, kitchen supplies, church work, money. I did not run west over a compliment." "No one said you did." Grace looked toward the dark window. "But that is what they will think." Mrs. Bell's face softened. "Some will," she said. "Foolish people like simple stories. Woman believed man. Man ran. Woman shamed. It saves them from doing the harder work of understanding. Grace folded her hands. And what is the harder story? That a woman wanted a life of her own, and a liar used that hope as bait. Grace lowered her head. Those words found the place she had been trying not to touch. Hope as bait. She slept badly that night, but she did sleep. When morning came, she dressed in her gray gown, packed her trunk, and placed Thomas's letters in a cloth bag, separate from her good things. She did not know yet whether she would keep them, burn them, or hand them to the law if the law could be made to care about a woman's ruined journey. Mrs. Bell rode with her in Caleb's wagon, sitting upright like a judge headed to court. Caleb drove. Grace sat beside Mrs. Bell with her hands folded over her gloves. The road to Ash Hollow stretched over pale grass and low hills. Frost still lay in the shadows. The sky had the clear, hard look of early winter. Every mile carried Grace farther from town gossip and deeper into a country that felt too wide for secrets, though she knew better now. Secrets could live anywhere, in letters, in ledgers, in a man's smooth voice. Ash Hollow appeared near noon. It was not beautiful in a storybook way. The ranch house sat low against the land, built of weathered wood and stone, with a barn behind it and corrals to the west. A line of ash trees bent near a dry wash, their bare branches moving in the wind. Smoke rose from the chimney in a thin gray ribbon. A woman stood on the porch, holding a broom like a weapon. "That is Lottie Finch," Caleb said. Mrs. Bell made a satisfied sound. "Good. She looks ready to strike anyone who deserves it." Lottie came down the steps as the wagon stopped. She was small, straight-backed, and sharp-eyed, with gray hair pinned so tight it seemed to pull every lie out of the air before it could settle. "You Miss Miller?" she asked. "Yes, ma'am." "Can you cook?" "Some." "Can you keep accounts?" "Yes." "Can you stand a quiet house?" Grace glanced at Caleb before answering. "I believe so." Lottie studied her for another second. Quiet is not always peace, best know the difference. Grace liked her at once. The room off the kitchen was plain but clean. It had a narrow bed, a small chest, and a window facing the ash trees. Mrs. Bell inspected the bedding, the latch, the stove pipe, and the hallway as if she were purchasing the entire ranch on Grace's behalf. "It will do," she announced. Caleb looked relieved. Lottie showed Grace the kitchen, the pantry, the water pump, the back step, and the place where Caleb left bills when he remembered to bring them inside, which was a chipped blue bowl near the door. The bowl was empty. Grace looked at him. "I have been using the flour sack," he said. "I know," she replied. Lottie snorted. That afternoon, Grace sat at Caleb's kitchen table and began the Ash Hollow ledger in earnest. Caleb brought in the cigar box from the barn. Inside were more receipts, 2 nails, a broken spur buckle, and a note that said only, "Ask Walt about the brown cow." Grace held it up. "Who is Walt?" "Former hired hand." "And the brown cow?" "I cannot recall." She placed it in the very unknown pile. As the day faded, Caleb came and went with chores. Lottie moved around the kitchen, muttering at the stove. Grace worked by lamplight, writing clean columns where there had been disorder. The house was strange, but not unfriendly. A horse stamped in the barn. The wind pressed at the windows. Caleb's coat hung by the door, still carrying the smell of cold air and hay. For one quiet hour, Grace forgot to feel abandoned. Then, while sorting the cigar box, she found a folded receipt from the Willow Creek bank. It was not Caleb's. It had been mixed in by mistake, likely from the livery or a store counter. The name on it made her stop. Thomas Redding. Beneath his name was a withdrawal amount large enough to empty a modest account. But at the bottom, in the banker's neat hand, someone had written a note. Funds transferred from account held under T. Vale. Grace's pulse quickened. She carried the paper to Caleb, who stood near the stove washing his hands. "He had 2 names at the bank," she said. Caleb took the receipt, read it, and his expression darkened. Before he could answer, a hard knock struck the front door. Lottie turned from the stove. Caleb dried his hands slowly and went to open it. A man stood outside with snow dusting his shoulders and a black leather satchel in one hand. He looked past Caleb and fixed his eyes on Grace. Miss Miller, he said. Grace rose from her chair. Yes. The stranger removed his hat. My name is Daniel Cross. I came from Cheyenne. I believe Thomas Vale promised to marry my sister. If you believe one act of courage can save another heart from breaking, stay close to this story, because Grace is about to learn she was never the only one waiting. The name Thomas Vale seemed to steal the heat from the room. Grace stood beside the kitchen table with Caleb's bank receipt still in her hand. Lottie Finch stopped moving near the stove. Even the fire gave a low crack, as if it too had heard something it did not like. Caleb opened the door wider, but he did not step aside at once. Who are you? He asked. The stranger looked tired enough to fall asleep standing, but his eyes were clear. He was perhaps 30, with a trimmed beard, a worn brown coat, and boots dusted white from the road. He held the black satchel close to his side. Daniel Cross, he said again. I run a freight office in Cheyenne. My sister's name is Clara Cross. She received letters from a man calling himself Thomas Vale for near 5 months. Grace's fingers tightened around the receipt. Did she come here? She asked. Daniel looked at her and his face changed. No, ma'am, he said quietly. She almost did. Caleb stepped aside then. Come in before you freeze. Daniel entered and removed his hat. Snowflakes melted in his hair. Lottie shut the door behind him with more force than necessary. Sit, she said. You look like a fence post after a storm. Daniel obeyed, lowering himself into a chair by the table. Lottie poured coffee without asking and set it before him. He wrapped both hands around the cup, but did not drink. Grace sat across from him. Caleb remained standing near the door, arms folded, his face set in that quiet way that made him look less like a rancher and more like a man guarding a line no one else could see. Daniel looked at Grace. I was told at the post office in town that you had come for Thomas Redding. Grace nodded once. I did. And he ran. Yes. Daniel closed his eyes for a second. Lord help us. Grace placed the bank receipt on the table between them. We learned today that Thomas Redding and Thomas Vale were the same man. Daniel looked down at the paper, then reached into his satchel. He drew out a packet of letters tied with black string. These are my sister S, he said. She gave them to me after she fell ill. Grace's breath caught. Ill. Not from him, not directly, Daniel said quickly. She took a fever in September. Before that, she was packing. She had bought cloth for a wedding dress. She had not told many people because she thought it romantic to surprise the town after everything was settled. His mouth twisted with pain. Clara always liked stories better than warnings. Grace looked at the black-tied letters. They seemed like a dark mirror of her own blue bundle upstairs. Did he ask her to travel to Willow Creek? Caleb asked. Not Willow Creek, Daniel said. He told her he had a ranch outside Laramie, Silver Lantern. Grace shut her eyes. There it was again, the pretty name, the stolen place. Daniel noticed her reaction. You know it. He promised me the same ranch, Grace said. Only he said it stood near Willow Creek. A muscle jumped in Daniel's jaw. Then he was using one lie in different towns. Lottie muttered something under her breath that sounded unfit for a church pew. Daniel untied the letters and spread a few on the table. Grace did not touch them at first. She only looked. The handwriting was the same, the slope of the letters, the careful loops, the way he made a capital T like a hook. Caleb picked up one page and read silently. His eyes darkened. What is it? Grace asked. Caleb handed it to her. The line near the middle read, When you come west, Clara, you will not be a guest in my home. You will be the missing heart of it. Grace felt something twist inside her. Not jealousy, not even surprise, it was worse than that, it was recognition. He had not only lied to each woman, he had learned what each heart wanted to hear. To Grace, he had written of useful hands, ledgers, partnership, and room to breathe. To Clara, he had written of being cherished, chosen, made the heart of a home. Daniel stared at the cup in front of him. When Clara fell ill and could not travel, she wrote him begging pardon for the delay. The letter came back undelivered. That was when I started asking. I went to Laramie. No Thomas Vale, no Silver Lantern. Then I found one old ranch hand who remembered a man using that name in Cheyenne and taking mail through Willow Creek. "So you came," Caleb said. "I came because Clara kept blaming herself," Daniel said, his voice roughening. "She thought she had lost a good man by getting sick. She lay in bed apologizing to letters." Grace covered her mouth with one hand. That broke something in her more than her own humiliation had. She could bear the thought of being fooled. She could bear the empty platform. But imagining a sick woman asking forgiveness from a lie made her anger feel clean and bright. "Does she know now?" Grace asked. "Some," Daniel said. "Not all. I did not want to bring her rumors. I wanted truth." Caleb leaned over the table and tapped the bank receipt. "This is truth enough to start." Daniel read it carefully. "T. Vale, same man." "Yes." Grace looked at both men. "There may be more women." No one disagreed. Outside, the wind pressed snow against the windows. The ranch house felt smaller, gathered around lamplight and hard facts. Lottie took the coffee pot and filled each cup again, though no one had asked. "What do we do?" Daniel said. Grace looked at the letters, then at the receipt. Yesterday, she would have said nothing. She would have hidden the hurt, found work, and tried to become a woman no one could pity. But the truth had widened. This was no longer only about Grace Miller and a man who did not meet her train. It was about Clara Cross lying in Cheyenne with shame that did not belong to her. It was about other names, other stations, other trunks. "We gather proof," Grace said. Caleb looked at her. She held his gaze. "We gather his letters, the bank record, the post office memory, and anything else we can find. Then we take it to the judge or sheriff, whoever can make his name known before he uses a new one." Daniel straightened a little. "I can write to Cheyenne for Clara's dressmaker. She heard the name. So did my clerk at the freight office." "I will ask Miss Whitcomb what else she remembers," Grace said. Caleb shook his head. "Not alone." Grace's eyes narrowed. "I was not asking permission." "I know," he said. "I was offering company." The room went quiet. It was a small thing, the difference between those two sentences. But Grace felt it. Thomas had always written as if her life would become safe only when it belonged to him. Caleb spoke as if her courage already belonged to her, and he was only willing to walk beside it. Daniel gathered his sister's letters, but left one on the table. "Keep that," he said. "It bears the Silver Lantern name. It may help." Grace touched the edge of the page. "Thank you." He rose to leave, but Caleb looked toward the dark window. "You cannot ride back to town in this snow." "I have slept in worse places," Daniel said. "Not tonight," Lottie snapped. "There's a cot in the storeroom. You can be grateful after breakfast." Daniel looked as if he might argue, then wisely did not. Later, after the house had settled and Lottie had gone to her room, Grace stood alone in the kitchen with the two letters side by side. Clara's letter, her own letter, same hand, same promise wearing different clothes. Caleb came in quietly from checking the barn. Snow clung to his shoulders. "You should sleep," he said. "I will." But neither of them moved. Grace looked at the letters and spoke softly. "He made me feel foolish." Caleb's face tightened. "You were not foolish." "I know that in my head." "Your heart will catch up," he said. Grace looked at him then, surprised by the gentleness of it. Before she could answer, Daniel's voice called from the storeroom, low but urgent. "Mr. Hart, Miss Miller, you need to see this." Caleb crossed the room first. Grace followed with the lamp. Daniel stood by his open satchel, holding a small photograph in his hand. "It was tucked behind Clara's letters," he said. Grace lifted the lamp closer. The photograph showed Thomas Redding standing beside a woman in a dark traveling dress. On the back, in neat handwriting, were 3 words. "My wife, Eleanor." The photograph trembled in Daniel's hand. Not because the room was cold. The kitchen fire still burned low in the stove, and the lamp in Grace's hand cast a steady yellow circle over the table. But Daniel's fingers shook as he stared at the woman in the picture. Grace could not look away. Thomas Redding stood straight and proud, one hand resting on the back of a chair. His hair was neatly combed. His coat was fine. His face carried the smooth confidence of a man who had practiced looking trustworthy. Beside him stood a woman with light hair pinned at the nape of her neck. She wore a dark dress with a high collar and a small brooch at her throat. She was not smiling. Her eyes looked straight into the camera with a tired dignity that made Grace's chest ache. "My wife, Eleanor." Caleb took the photograph carefully, as if it might burn his fingers. "Where did Clara get this?" he asked. Daniel swallowed. "I don't know, I never saw it before tonight." Grace set the lamp on the table. "Could Thomas have sent it by mistake?" "No," Daniel said. "Clara kept everything in order. She tied his letters by date. This was hidden behind the last of them, folded inside a blank sheet." Caleb turned the photograph over again, studying the handwriting. Not the same hand as Redding's letters. Grace leaned closer. He was right. The writing on the back was smaller, tighter, and more careful than Thomas's sweeping script. "A woman wrote that," Lottie said from the doorway. Everyone turned. She stood in her night wrapper with a shawl around her shoulders, looking displeased that important trouble had dared to happen after she had gone to bed. Grace picked up the photograph and studied the words. "Eleanor," she said softly. "She wanted Clara to know." Daniel's face shifted with alarm. "You think his wife sent it to my sister?" "Maybe," Grace said, "or someone who knew the truth did." Caleb pulled out a chair and sat, his eyes fixed on the picture. "There may be a wife somewhere trying to warn the women he deceives." "Or a wife he left behind," Grace said. That thought settled over them all. The house grew quiet except for the wind rubbing against the walls. Daniel sank into a chair. "Clara never told me she had it. Maybe she found it and did not know what to do. Maybe she was too ashamed." "Shame belongs to him," Grace said. Her voice came sharper than she expected. Daniel looked at her, startled. Grace did not apologize. "She did not write false letters," she continued. "She did not change names. She did not promise homes that were not hers. Your sister has no shame in this." Daniel's eyes grew wet, though he blinked it back. "I wish she could hear you say that." "Then take the words to her," Grace said, "and mean them when you do." Caleb looked at Grace across the lamplight. There was something in his face she did not know how to name. Pride, perhaps, or sorrow, or the quiet surprise of watching a person stand taller after being struck. Grace looked away first. The next morning, snow lay thin across Ash Hollow. The world outside was pale and still, with the ash trees black against the white ground. Daniel left after breakfast with coffee in a tin cup, 2 biscuits wrapped in cloth, and a copy of the bank note Grace wrote by hand. Caleb insisted on riding with him as far as Willow Creek. Grace wanted to go too. Caleb did not forbid it. He only looked at the sky, then at the road, then at her thin city boots. "The snow is light," Grace said before he could speak. "The mud beneath it is not. I have walked through mud before. In St. Louis." Grace narrowed her eyes. "Mud exists east of Wyoming, Mr. Hart." A faint smile pulled at one corner of his mouth, then disappeared. "I do not doubt it, but I need you here with the letters. If Daniel rides into town with them and folks start talking before we know enough, Redding may hear through some friend and vanish deeper." That was sensible. Grace disliked that it was sensible. "I will stay," she said. "Thank you." Not good, not obedient, not wise girl, only thank you. After the men rode out, Grace spent the morning copying every useful line from Thomas's letters into the clean ledger. She noted dates, claims, names, places, and descriptions. Silver Lantern, Cottonwoods, Creek, East Pasture, promise of marriage, request for arrival on the Friday train. Yellow Rose. Lottie worked near her, kneading bread with fierce hands. "You write like a county clerk," Lottie said. "My father taught me accounts when I was 16. "He taught you well." Grace dipped the pen again. "He would be grieved to see what I used that learning for." "Finding truth. Believing a lie first." Lottie stopped kneading. "Child," she said, "a knife can cut bread or cut a hand. The blame lies in the hand holding it, not the bread." Grace looked up slowly. Lottie went back to the dough. "That man used good things wrong. Hope, letters, marriage, loneliness, wanting a home, those are not foolish things, they are human things." Grace sat with the pen still in her hand. The old woman's words did not heal everything. Healing did not come like a curtain dropping after the last line of a play, but they opened a window somewhere inside Grace, just enough for air. By afternoon, Caleb returned alone. Grace heard his horse before she saw him through the kitchen window. He rode slow, shoulders heavy. When he entered, he removed his hat and brushed snow from his coat. "Daniel took the stage toward Cheyenne," he said. "He will send word when Clara can answer." "And Miss Whitcomb?" "I spoke to her." Grace stood. What did she say? Caleb reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. She remembered one more thing. A letter came through last spring from a town called Mercy Falls, Montana, addressed to Thomas Vale. The return name was Eleanor Briggs. Grace went still. "Briggs," she said. Maybe his wife's maiden name, maybe not. Did he answer it? Yes, Ada remembers because he argued over the postage, said he had already paid too much to hear from that woman. Lottie made a disgusted sound. Caleb placed the paper on the table. Ada wrote down what she could swear to. She signed it. Grace unfolded it and read the postmistress's careful statement. Thomas Vale, Thomas Redding, Cheyenne, St. Louis, Mercy Falls, Eleanor Briggs. The web was no longer a feeling. It had lines now. "We need to write to Mercy Falls," Grace said. "I already sent a wire through the station," Caleb replied. Grace looked up. "You did. I thought you would want it done." She studied him. "What did you say?" "I asked whether an Eleanor Briggs or Eleanor Redding resided there, and whether she could be reached regarding Thomas Redding, also known as Thomas Vale." Grace waited. Caleb shifted his hat in his hands. "I kept it plain." "I imagined you would." The corner of his mouth moved. Then his face sobered. "There is more." Grace braced herself. "The sheriff says Redding has not broken a law clean enough for him to chase across territory. Not yet. False promises are hard to put in irons unless money changed hands under proof of fraud." Grace looked down at the ledger. "He asked me to come here. He knew I spent money to travel." "Yes." "He drained accounts under 2 names." "Yes." "He deceived at least 2 women." "Yes." "But no law can catch him." Caleb's eyes were troubled, not easily. Grace sat down slowly. For a few moments, anger had nowhere to go. It moved through her like wind through cracks in a wall. The law wanted tidy harm, receipts, signatures, a stolen horse, a broken window. It did not know what to do with a woman sitting alone on a station platform while her future walked away under another name. Lottie poured coffee and set it in front of her. "Then let truth do what law cannot," the old woman said. Grace looked at the ledger. Truth. Truth in columns, truth in letters, truth in a photograph of a wife named Eleanor. Truth that could be carried from town to town faster than Thomas could make a new name if enough people had courage to speak it. That evening, Grace wrote 3 letters. One to Daniel Cross for Clara. One to Ada Whitcomb, asking for any further records she could honorably provide. One to the postmaster at Mercy Falls. The third took the longest. "Dear Sir, I write in search of a woman named Eleanor Briggs or Eleanor Redding who may have knowledge of a man calling himself Thomas Redding or Thomas Vale. I do not seek scandal. I seek truth and perhaps the chance to prevent further harm." She paused there, pen hovering. Caleb sat across from her, mending a strap badly. He had pricked his thumb twice and pretended not to. Grace looked at him. "Does that sound too strong?" "No." "Too weak?" "No." "That is not helpful." He looked up. "It sounds like you, clear enough to stand on." Grace lowered her eyes before he could see what those words did to her. 2 days passed, then 3. Work filled the hours. Caleb rode fence. Lottie kept the kitchen in order. Grace rebuilt the Ash Hollow accounts until the ranch began to make sense on paper. She found 2 more overcharges, 1 unpaid cattle bill, and a pattern of small losses Caleb had accepted because he trusted too easily and checked too little. On the 4th evening, he came in carrying a small cloth parcel. For you, he said, placing it by her ledger. Grace looked at it with suspicion. What is it? Open it. Inside was a pair of sturdy brown boots. Plain, well-made, warm-lined, and much better suited to Wyoming mud than anything she owned. Grace touched the leather. I cannot accept these. Yes, you can. They cost money. So do ruined feet. She looked up, Mr. Hart. Miss Miller. They stared at each other until Lottie laughed from the stove. Put the boots on, girl. Pride will not keep your toes warm. Grace looked back at the boots. Her throat tightened in a way that irritated her. Thomas had promised her a house, a name, a future made of golden words. Caleb had brought boots because he had noticed the mud taking hold of her hems. She ran one hand over the leather. Thank you, she said quietly. Caleb nodded, but his ears colored slightly, and he went outside to check a gate that almost certainly did not need checking. The next morning, Grace wore the boots to the barn. The ground was hard with frost. Her breath made small white clouds. Caleb was saddling a bay horse when she stepped inside. He looked down at the boots, then back at the saddle. They fit. Yes. Good. Thank you again. He adjusted the cinch with unnecessary focus. You already said that. I know, I wanted to say it twice. He looked at her then. For a brief moment, the barn seemed too quiet. A horse shifted in its stall. Dust floated in the pale light coming through the boards. Grace felt the strangeness of standing close to a man who had not asked anything from her, and yet had given her steadier ground than all Thomas's letters combined. Caleb opened his mouth to say something. A rider's shout cut through the yard. They turned. A boy from the telegraph office came galloping in, waving a yellow paper over his head. Message for Miss Miller. Grace stepped out into the cold sunlight. The boy handed her the wire. Caleb stood beside her, silent. Grace unfolded it with stiff fingers. Mercy Falls confirms a leaner Briggs Redding residing here. Gravely ill but living. Requests Miss Miller come if able. Says Thomas took more than names. Says bring photograph. Grace read the last line twice. Then she looked at Caleb. What does that mean? He asked softly. Grace held the paper tighter. It means his wife is still alive, she said, and she has been waiting for someone to believe her. Grace packed before sunrise. She did not pack much. A gray dress, a clean blouse, her Bible, the blue-tied letters, Clara's copied letter, the photograph, and the ledger pages that showed Thomas Redding had used 2 names at the bank. The new boots stood beside the bed, still carrying a thin line of barn dust along the soles. She looked at them for a moment before putting them on. They made her feel steadier than she wanted to admit. Caleb was already hitching the wagon when she stepped outside. The sky was pale, and the ranch lay quiet under frost. Smoke lifted from the kitchen chimney. In the doorway, Lottie held a cloth bundle of food and wore the expression of a woman who disliked journeys but disliked cowardice more. You eat before you get stubborn, Lottie said, pressing the bundle into Grace's hands. Yes, ma'am. Lottie looked at Caleb, and you keep your eyes open. I intend to. Intending is not the same as doing. Caleb accepted that without argument. Mercy Falls, Montana was not close. They had to ride to Willow Creek, take the train north as far as the line allowed, then hire a wagon for the last hard miles. Caleb had offered to go without making it sound like an offer. He simply said the road was long and 2 witnesses were better than 1. Grace did not argue. There were some roads a woman could walk alone, and some roads where honest company did not lessen courage. By noon, they were on the train, moving through a country that looked emptied by winter. Grace sat by the window with the photograph wrapped in cloth on her lap. Caleb sat across from her, his hat on his knees, watching the passing land as if it might turn on them without warning. You have been quiet, he said after a long while. I guess that. Grace looked at the pale fields sliding past. What if she blames me? Elinors? Yes. For believing him. For being one more proof of what he did. Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. A woman who sends for you from her sickbed is not looking for someone to blame. She is looking for someone to hear her. Grace wanted to believe that. I do not know what I am to her, she said. A witness. The word stayed with her. A witness. Not a fool, not a ruined bride, not a woman waiting to be laughed at by a town. A witness. Someone who had seen part of the truth and could carry it without hiding. They reached Mercy Falls 2 days later, cold, tired, and stiff from travel. The town sat in a narrow valley, with steep hills rising dark behind it. Snow rested on the rooftops and gathered along the road in gray ridges. It was larger than Willow Creek, but sadder somehow, as if winter had pressed its hand too long over the place. The postmaster directed them to a small house at the end of Pine Street. Mrs. Redding don't see many folks, he said, rubbing his hands near the stove. But she said if a young woman came asking with a photograph, I was to send her straight on. Grace's stomach tightened. The house on Pine Street had a gate that sagged and a porch swept clean in spite of the snow. A woman in a brown shawl opened the door before they knocked twice. She was older than Grace by perhaps 10 years, with tired eyes and a thin face that had once been very pretty. Miss Miller, she asked. Yes. The woman looked past her to Caleb. Mr. Hart, Caleb said, removing his hat. I came as witness and escort. The woman nodded. I am Ruth Ann Price. Eleanor is my sister. Grace held the cloth-wrapped photograph carefully. May we see her? Ruth Ann stepped aside. Inside, the house was warm but quiet. A kettle steamed on the stove. A small table stood near the window with medicine bottles lined in a row. The back room door was partly open, and a weak voice called from within. Let her come. Grace felt Caleb pause behind her. He did not follow at once. She entered the room alone. Eleanor Redding lay propped against white pillows, her hair loose over one shoulder. She was thinner than in the photograph, her cheekbones sharp, her hands resting like folded paper on the quilt. But her eyes were alive. They fixed on Grace with painful steadiness. Grace stopped by the bed. For a moment, neither woman spoke. Then Eleanor said, So you are the one from St. Louis. Grace nodded, yes. And Clara from Cheyenne. She is living, Grace said softly. Her brother came to us, she was spared the journey. Eleanor closed her eyes. Thank God for one small mercy. Grace sat in the chair beside the bed. Her hands felt clumsy. She unwrapped the photograph and placed it on the quilt. I was told to bring this. Eleanor looked at it, and a faint, bitter smile touched her mouth. I sent that to Clara. I did not know whether she received it. She did, but she hid it. Her brother only found it days ago. Eleanor's eyes filled, but no tears fell. Poor girl. Grace looked at the woman before her. This was Thomas's wife, not a rumor, not a name on the back of a picture. A living woman with a worn quilt, a quiet house, and pain that had been waiting longer than Grace's own. Why did you send it? Grace asked. Because I could not chase him anymore, Eleanor said, but I could try to place stones in the road behind him. Her voice was weak, so Ruth Ann came in and held a cup to her lips. Eleanor drank a little, then continued. Thomas was born Thomas Briggs. He took my name when we married because my father owned land and he liked the sound of respect. Later he became Redding, then Vale. I do not know how many others. Grace listened without moving. He was kind at first, Eleanor said. Not truly kind, I know that now, but he watched what people lacked and became the shape of it. To my father, he was a hardworking son. To me, he was a devoted husband. To lonely women, he became a future. The words landed deep. Grace whispered, yes. Eleanor turned her head toward her. He took money from my father's estate, not all at once, slow enough that I doubted myself. Then he forged my name on a sale paper and left with the better team. When I tried to warn people, I was told a wife's anger can make any tale sound true. Caleb, standing at the doorway now, lowered his eyes. Grace's fingers curled around the edge of her skirt. You are not believed, she said. No, Eleanor drew a careful breath. That is why I asked you to come. A wife can be dismissed. One woman can be dismissed, but not three, not with letters, not with bank papers, not with a photograph he could not explain away. If Grace's courage in this moment speaks to you, Stay with the story, because sometimes justice begins when one woman finally believes another. Grace reached into her bag and drew out her letters, Clara's copied letter and the bank receipt. Eleanor looked at the papers with a tired fire in her eyes. "There is one more thing," she said. Ruth Ann stiffened. "Eleanor, not today." "Yes, today," Eleanor said. "Open the cedar box." Ruth Ann hesitated, then crossed to the dresser and lifted a small cedar box from the bottom drawer. She placed it on the bed. Eleanor gave Grace the key from a chain around her neck. Inside were 3 items: a marriage certificate for Eleanor Briggs and Thomas Briggs, a land transfer bearing Eleanor's forged signature, and a torn advertisement from a matrimonial paper circled in ink. Grace picked up the advertisement. It was not Thomas's old notice. It was new. The ink circle marked a reply address in Denver under the name Charles Benton. The description was painfully familiar: a lonely rancher, good land, seeks honest woman for marriage and partnership. Grace looked at Eleanor. "He is still doing it," Eleanor said. Caleb stepped fully into the room. Grace held the paper so tight it bent in her hand. At the bottom of the torn advertisement was a date. 3 weeks ago. Grace stared at the torn advertisement until the words seemed to move on the paper. Charles Benton. Lonely rancher. Good land. Honest woman. Marriage and partnership. It was Thomas again. A new name, a new doorway, a new woman somewhere reading those words with a heart full of careful hope. Caleb stepped closer to the bed. "Denver." Eleanor nodded weakly. "Ruth Ann found it in a paper that came through the post office. I knew the shape of his writing in the reply address. Even when he changes names, he cannot change the way he invites trust." Grace's mouth went dry. "Has anyone answered it?" "I do not know," Eleanor said. "That is why you must move faster than I could." Ruth Ann folded her arms, her face tight with worry. "My sister needs rest. We sent for the county man, but he said Denver is outside his reach unless proper papers are filed." Caleb looked at the forged land transfer. "This is proper enough if a judge will hear it." "He will hear it," Eleanor whispered. "If you take it to Judge Whitaker in Mercy Falls before you leave, he knew my father. He may not have believed me before, but he will not ignore 3 sets of letters and a bank trail." Grace held the advertisement as if it were a live coal. The trip had already pulled her far from Willow Creek, farther still from the life she had expected. Now the road seemed to stretch again, all the way to Denver, where Thomas might be smiling over fresh paper and waiting for another woman to trust him. "I came west because of him," Grace said softly. "Now I must chase him because of who he might hurt next." Caleb looked at her with quiet concern. "You do not have to carry all of this alone." Grace turned to him. "I know." The answer surprised them both. A few weeks earlier, she would have held herself apart, proving she needed no one. But hardship had taught her a sharper truth. Help did not always mean weakness. Sometimes it meant there was another hand near the lamp, another set of eyes on the dark road, another person willing to stand when the truth became heavy. Eleanor watched them from the pillow, and for the first time her tired face softened. "He is not like Thomas," she said. Grace looked down. "No," she said, "he is not." Caleb said nothing, but he turned his hat in his hands, and Grace saw the old nervous motion return. That afternoon, they went to Judge Whitaker. He was a broad old man with white hair, tired eyes, and a courtroom that smelled of paper, coal smoke, and damp wool. At first, his face carried the guarded patience of a man who had heard too many bitter domestic troubles and expected another. Then Grace laid the letters on his desk. Then Caleb laid down the bank copy. Then Ruth Ann placed Eleanor's marriage certificate and the forged transfer beside them. Then Grace unfolded the photograph. By the time she finished speaking, Judge Whitaker was no longer leaning back in his chair. He was forward, both hands on the desk, reading each paper with slow care. "He used Thomas Redding in Willow Creek," Grace said. "Thomas Vale in Cheyenne, Charles Benton in Denver. Eleanor says he was born Thomas Briggs." The judge looked at the forged land paper. "This signature is not Eleanor's." "No," Ruth Ann said, and the land sold 3 weeks after he left her. Judge Whittaker removed his spectacles and rubbed his brow. "I should have listened sooner," he said. Ruth Ann's face hardened. "Yes, you should have." The old man accepted the words like a deserved blow. "I can issue a sworn notice and wire Denver," he said. "Forgery tied to stolen property gives stronger footing than false courtship. If he is using an advertisement under a false name while carrying stolen funds, the sheriff there may hold him until these papers arrive." Grace's knees felt weak with relief, but she did not sit. "Will it be enough?" she asked. Judge Whittaker looked at her over the desk. "Enough to make him stop running easy." That had to be enough for now. The wires went out before evening. One to Denver Law, one to Willow Creek, one to Cheyenne for Daniel and Clara. The telegraph clerk tapped the message with brisk fingers while Grace stood nearby, listening to the sharp clicking sound that carried truth across miles faster than any horse. For once, Thomas would not be the only one sending words west and east. By nightfall, Grace and Caleb returned to Ruth Ann's house. Eleanor was asleep, one hand resting near the cedar box. Grace stood in the doorway and watched her. "She looks lighter," Ruth Ann whispered. "Will she recover?" Ruth Ann did not answer quickly. Maybe in body, maybe not, but being believed has given her something medicine could not. Grace nodded. Later, after supper, she stepped onto the porch. Snow had stopped falling. The moon shone over Mercy Falls, laying silver on the road and rooftops. The air was so cold it stung her lungs, but she welcomed it. Cold made things clear. Caleb came out and stood beside her. For a while, neither spoke. Then he said, "When this is done, what do you want?" Grace looked toward the dark road. It was a simple question, but no one had asked it quite that way before. Thomas had told her what she would want. Her family had guessed what would be safe. The town had decided what would be proper. Caleb asked and waited. "I want to go back to Willow Creek," she said. His breath showed white in the air. "To Mrs. Bell. To settle what I owe her, yes. To Miss Whitcomb to thank her. To the station maybe, though I do not know why. Sometimes a person has to look at the place where a hurt began and see that it did not end there." Grace turned to him. He did not look away. "And after Willow Creek?" he asked. She thought of Ash Hollow, the kitchen table, Lottie's sharp voice, the ash trees outside the small room, the ledger pages lined clean, the boots on her feet, Caleb leaving room for her silence. "I want to go back to Ash Hollow," she said. His hands tightened around the porch rail. "To the accounts?" he asked softly. Grace almost smiled, among other things. The stillness between them warmed, even in the bitter cold. Before either could say more, the front door opened behind them. Ruth Ann stood there holding a yellow telegraph paper. Her face was pale. "It came from Denver," she said. Grace took the wire with both hands. Caleb leaned close enough to read by moonlight. "Charles Benton located at Union House Hotel. Attempted to leave after inquiry. Detained pending papers. Woman from Kansas found in his possession of correspondence. Claims she was to marry him next week." Grace closed her eyes. Another woman. Another near escape. Caleb's voice was low beside her. "They have him." Grace opened her eyes and looked at the snowy road. "No," she said quietly. "Now he has to face us." By sunrise, Grace was on the road again. Denver waited 2 days away, and every mile felt heavier than the one before it. Caleb rode beside her in the hired wagon, quiet as the mountains behind them. He had not tried to dress the truth in comfort. Another woman from Kansas had almost stepped into the same snare. Thomas, or Charles Benton, or whatever name he wore that morning, had been stopped with fresh letters in his coat and a train ticket in his pocket. He had been ready to run again. When Grace and Caleb reached Denver, the city felt too loud after Mercy Falls and Willow Creek. Wagons rattled over frozen ruts. Men shouted near the depot. Smoke hung low between brick buildings and wooden fronts. At the sheriff's office, a tired deputy led them into a back room where Judge Whittaker's papers had already arrived by wire and courier. Thomas sat at a table with his wrists free but watched close. He looked smaller than Grace remembered from the picture she had made in her mind. Not weak, not sorry, only trapped. His fine coat was wrinkled. His hair was still carefully combed. Even now, he tried to look like a gentleman caught in a misunderstanding. Then he saw Grace. For 1 second, his face lost its polish. "Grace," he said, as if her name still belonged in his mouth. Caleb took 1 step forward, but Grace lifted her hand slightly. He stopped. She walked to the table and placed the blue-tied letters before Thomas. "You left me at Willow Creek Station," she said. Thomas glanced at the sheriff, then forced a sad little smile. "I can explain." "No," Grace said. "You can speak. That is not the same as explaining." The sheriff's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. Thomas looked at Caleb. "This man has filled your head with lies." Grace untied the blue ribbon. "These are your letters. This is Clara Cross's letter under the name Thomas Vale. This is Alina Redding's marriage paper. This is the forged land transfer. This is your bank note under 2 names. And this," she said, laying down the torn advertisement, "is Charles Benton looking for another honest woman." Thomas stared at the papers. For the first time, silence found him. The door opened, and a young woman entered with her father at her side. She was the woman from Kansas. Her name was Mary Ellen Price, and she wore a green traveling cloak with the collar held tight at her throat. Her eyes were red, but her chin was lifted. She looked at Thomas as if she were seeing him from a great distance. "You told me your wife died," Mary Ellen said. Thomas lowered his eyes. Grace felt no triumph, only a deep, weary sadness. That was his gift, she thought, not love, not hope. He gave women grief and left them to clean it from their own lives. The sheriff read the charges plainly. Forgery, fraud, false identity tied to stolen property. There would be a formal hearing, there would be witnesses, there would be time for Thomas to answer to more than one name. But the most important judgment had already happened in that small room. He had run out of shadows. Alina's papers were accepted. Clara's letters were entered. Grace signed her statement with a hand that did not tremble. Mary Ellen signed hers after a long breath, then turned away from Thomas without giving him another word. Outside the sheriff's office, Mary Ellen began to cry at last. Grace did not speak. She only stepped close and took the young woman's gloved hand. "He made you believe him," Grace said softly. "That is his shame, not yours." Mary Ellen nodded through tears. Caleb stood a little distance away, hat in hand, watching Grace as if he had just seen a sunrise break over land he thought he already knew. When they returned to Mercy Falls, Alina was awake. Ruth Ann read the sheriff's message aloud beside the bed. Alina closed her eyes and one tear slipped down into her hair. "Not because he is caught," she whispered, "because someone finally heard." Grace sat beside her and took her thin hand. "We heard you," she said. Alina pressed the cedar box key into Grace's palm. "Keep the copies safe. Truth needs a place to live." Grace closed her fingers around it. Days later, Grace and Caleb returned to Willow Creek. The same station platform waited under a pale winter sky. The boards creaked beneath Grace's new boots as she stepped down from the train. This time, she did not carry hope like a fragile dish. She carried it like a lamp that had survived wind. Mrs. Bell met her with a hug. Miss Ada Whitcomb wiped her spectacles 3 times and pretended it was dust. Daniel's letter soon arrived from Cheyenne, saying Clara had cried when she learned the truth, then asked for fresh paper to write to Grace herself. Thomas Redding's name traveled now, but not as he wished. It traveled in warnings, signed statements, and honest mouths. No mob chased him. No cruel revenge came. Only truth, steady and patient, walking into every room he had tried to darken. A week after returning, Grace went alone to Willow Creek Station. Caleb found her there near sunset, standing by the same bench where he had first seen her trunk. The blue ribbon was in her hand. The letters were gone. He came to stand beside her. "Did you burn them?" "No," she said. "I gave them to Ada for the records, but I kept the ribbon." The winter wind moved softly through the station posts. "Why?" he asked. Grace looked at the strip of blue in her palm. "My mother gave it to me so I would remember where I came from. I tied it around a lie for too long. Now I think it should mean something else." Caleb was quiet. Grace turned to him. "Ash Hollow still needs its accounts kept." "It does. And Lottie still burns biscuits when she is angry." She says that is the stove's fault. And you still need better boots by the back door, so you stop tracking mud through the kitchen. Caleb looked at her then, and the careful wall in his face began to give way. Grace, he said, are you telling me you are coming home? She looked down the track where the train had once left her alone. Then she looked back at the man who had not promised her a perfect life, only stood beside her through an honest one. Yes, she said, if the room is still mine. Caleb's voice went rough. The room is yours, the table too, the place by the fire, any part of Ash Hollow you choose. Grace smiled, small at first, then fully. In time there would be more words, a court hearing, a letter to her mother, Clara's recovery, Eleanor's slow peace, perhaps one day a wedding beneath the ash trees with Lottie crying and denying it. But for that moment there was only the platform, the fading sun, and two people who had reached the end of one sorrow and the beginning of something true. If this story found a place in your heart, remember Grace not as the woman abandoned at a station, but as the woman who stood up, found the truth, and helped others stand with her. Caleb offered his arm. Grace took it. Together, they walked away from Willow Creek Station, past the place where her old life had fallen apart, toward the road north, where Ash Hollow waited under the wide Wyoming sky like a home that had been honest from the start.